Hello everyone and welcome to another step-by-step tutorial video. I promise you I will get a good microphone one of these days and stop using the built-in microphone on my Mac that picks up the room echo and everything else. But for now I'm using what I have. In this video we're going to be going over a Honda Accord that had a vibration issue under acceleration. The problem turned out to be the axle shafts. So here's a step-by-step video on how to replace the axle shafts on your Honda Accord. Obviously, first things first, you want to take the wheel off of the vehicle and then use a 34mm deep well impact socket and an impact. Remove the axle nut. It's a good idea to soak everything in PB Blaster. This eases the removal of not only the nuts and bolts, but the cotter pins as well. Once removed, I'll loosen the outer tie rod nut just enough so that threads are not exposed, and you'll see why. I'm going to use a hammer to strike the outer tie rod stud to loosen it from the spindle. I'll also do the same thing to the upper control arm. You'll also have to remove the wheel speed sensor wiring from the control arm and the spindle. Once this is complete, the brake line will have to be removed from the spindle as well. Remove the caliper from the brake caliper bracket. You may have to double up wrenches as you see me doing so in the video, but once they're broken loose, they can easily be removed with a ratchet wrench or a small impact driver. Remove the brake caliper. It's a good idea to support the caliper with a bungee cord, or as you can see me do here, hang it from the lower control arm. Because we are discarding this axle shaft and not reusing it, it's okay to strike the thread portion of the axle shaft with a hammer. Now with some vehicles you'll get lucky and you can get away with just disconnecting the upper control arm and the tie rod. But in the case of this Honda Accord, you can see there's not enough room to get the axle shaft out without removing the entire spindle. So we'll have to disconnect the wheel speed sensor, and unfortunately it's stuck in the spindle assembly, so we'll have to pull the wheel speed wiring out through the wheel well and disconnect it under the hood. When removing the entire spindle assembly, loosely install the upper control arm nut to help it stay in place. Removal of the lower ball joint from the lower control arm will be necessary. Now that we've separated the lower ball joint from the lower control arm assembly, the spindle can be removed. Separate the strut from the lower control arm. This will be necessary to remove the axle shaft. Position a drain pan under the vehicle to catch any oil that might come out of the transmission. Then use a large pry bar to pry the axle shaft out of the transmission assembly. And finally, remove the old axle shaft from the vehicle. The installation procedure is pretty simple, it's just the opposite. I found it helpful to lubricate the end of the axle shaft when installing it back into the transmission. Be very careful when installing these axle shafts if you don't have a seal protector, as the splines on the axle shaft can damage the seal and cause a fluid leak. Once in place, be sure the axle shaft is fully seated inside the transmission. There is a little C-clip that you'll have to get past, so don't be afraid to give it a little shove. Again, grease the end of the axle shaft, and then install the spindle assembly. When reinstalling the nuts onto the upper and lower control arms and the tie rod ends, remember to not over-tighten them, as you may have to go back and tighten the nuts additionally in order to install the cotter pin. Be sure to put a bend in the end of the cotter pin, as you can see here. That way the cotter pins don't back out. Don't forget to re-secure and reconnect the ABS speed sensor wire to prevent an ABS light. Reinstall the brake caliper and make sure no brake hardware has fallen out. I'm using the impact initially on this axle nut to run it down the rest of the threads. It's very important to use a torque wrench and achieve the proper torque when installing these axle nuts so you don't ruin the wheel bearing. Once complete, use a chisel and a hammer to put an indent in the axle shaft nut to keep it from backing off of the axle shaft. Last but not least, put the wheel back on the vehicle. Make sure to start your lug nuts by hand and then tighten them properly. As you can see, I'm using a torque stick on my impact. This limits the torque to 80 foot-pounds so I don't over-torque the lug nuts. And here's a time lapse of the passenger side for your enjoyment. Now let's go take her for a drive and see if we fixed the problem with the vibration. It occurred primarily around 50 to 60 miles per hour at highway speeds. So let's go get it up to highway speeds and see how this thing does with new axle shafts. It didn't take long to find out that we had indeed fixed the problem. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up if you did. And as always, I'll see you next time with more step-by-step how to repair your vehicle videos.